Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Jamil Zaki. Dr. Jamil Zaki is a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He is also the director of the Social Neuroscience Laboratory at Stanford. His laboratory focuses on key aspects of the human experience, such as empathy and cynicism, which lie at the heart of our ability to learn and can be barriers to learning, such as the case with cynicism. Today, you'll learn the optimal mindsets to adopt when trying to understand how to learn, conflict resolution, and how to navigate relationships of all kinds and in all contexts, including personal relationships and in the workplace. What sets Dr. Zaki's work apart from others is that he's able to take laboratory research and apply that to real-world scenarios to direct optimal strategies for things like how to set personal boundaries, how to learn information in uncertain and sometimes even uncomfortable environments, and then how to bring that to bear in terms of your relationship to yourself, your relationship to others, and how to collaborate with others in more effective ways. I want to be very clear that today's discussion, while focused on cynicism, trust, and empathy, is anything but squishy. In fact, it focuses on experimental data derived from real-world contexts. So it is both grounded in solid research and it is very practical, such that by the end of today's episode, you'll be armed with new knowledge about what cynicism is and is not, what empathy is and is not. This is very important because there's a lot of confusion about these words and what they mean. But I can assure you that by the end of today's discussion, you will have new frameworks and indeed new tools, protocols that you can use as strategies to better navigate situations and relationships of all kinds and indeed to learn better. I'd also like to mention that Dr. Zaki has authored a terrific new book entitled Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. And I've read this book and it is spectacular. There's a link to the book in the show note captions. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Maui Nui. Maui Nui venison is the most nutrient-dense and delicious red meat available. I've spoken before on this podcast about the fact that most of us should be seeking to get about 1 gram of quality protein per pound of body weight every day. That protein provides critical building blocks for things like muscle repair and synthesis, but also promotes overall health given the importance of muscle as an organ. Eating enough quality protein each day is also a terrific way to stave off hunger. One of the key things, however, is to make sure that you're getting enough quality protein without ingesting excess calories. Maui Nui venison has an extremely high quality protein to calorie ratio, such that getting that 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight is both easy and doesn't cause you to ingest an excess amount of calories. Also, Maui Nui venison is absolutely delicious. They have venison steaks, ground venison, and venison bone broth. I personally like and eat all of those. In fact, I probably eat a Maui Nui venison burger pretty much every day, and occasionally I'll swap that for a Maui Nui steak. And if you're traveling a lot or simply on the go, they have a very convenient Maui Nui venison jerky, which has 10 grams of quality protein per stick at just 55 calories. While Maui Nui offers the highest quality meat available, their supplies are limited. Responsible population management of the axis deer on the island of Maui means that they will not go beyond harvest capacity. Signing up for a membership is therefore the best way to ensure access to their high-quality meat. If you'd like to try Maui Nui venison, you can go to mauinuivenison.com/Huberman to get 20% off your membership or first order. Again, that's mauinuivenison.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Juve. Juve makes medical-grade red light therapy devices. Now, if there's one thing I've consistently emphasized on this podcast, it's the incredible impact that light can have on our biology. Now, in addition to sunlight, red light and near-infrared light have been shown to have positive effects on improving numerous aspects of cellular and organ health, including faster muscle recovery, improved skin health and wound healing, even improvements in acne, reducing pain and inflammation, improving mitochondrial function, and even improving vision itself. What sets Juve lights apart, and why they're my preferred red light therapy devices, is that they use clinically proven wavelengths, meaning it uses specific wavelengths of red light and near-infrared light in combination to trigger the optimal cellular adaptations. Personally, I use the Juve handheld light, both at home and when I travel. It's only about the size of a sandwich, so it's super portable and convenient to use. I also have a Juve whole body panel, and I use that about 3 or 4 times per week. If you'd like to try Joovv, you can go to Joovv, spelled JOOVV.com/Huberman. Joovv is offering an exclusive discount to all Huberman Lab listeners with up to $400 off select Joovv products. Again, that's Joovv, JOOVV.com/Huberman to get $400 off select Joovv products. Today's episode is also brought to us by Waking Up. Waking Up is a meditation app that offers hundreds of guided meditation programs, mindfulness trainings, yoga nidra sessions, and more. I started practicing meditation when I was about 15 years old, and it made a profound impact on my life. And by now, there are thousands of quality peer-reviewed studies that emphasize how useful mindfulness meditation can be for improving our focus, managing stress and anxiety, improving our mood, and much more. In recent years, I started using the Waking Up app for my meditations because I find it to be a terrific resource for allowing me to really be consistent with my meditation practice. Many people start a meditation practice and experience some benefits, but many people also have challenges keeping up with that practice. What I and so many other people love about the Waking Up app is that it has a lot of different meditations to choose from, and those meditations are of different durations. So it makes it very easy to keep up with your meditation practice, both from the perspective of novelty. You never get tired of those meditations. There's always something new to explore and to learn about yourself and about the effectiveness of meditation. And you can always fit meditation into your schedule, even if you only have 2 or 3 minutes per day in which to meditate. I also really like doing yoga nidra, or what is sometimes called non-sleep deep rest, for about 10 or 20 minutes because it is a great way to restore mental and physical vigor without the tiredness that some people experience when they wake up from a conventional nap. If you'd like to try the Waking Up app, please go to wakingup.com/Huberman, where you can access a free 30-day trial. Again, that's wakingup.com/Huberman to access a free 30-day trial. And now for my discussion with Dr. Jamil Zaki. Dr. Jamil Zaki, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Delighted to have you here and to learn from you. You have decided to tackle an enormous number of very interesting and challenging topics. Challenging because my read of it, not just your book, but of these fields and the science that you've done, is that people default to some complicated states and emotions sometimes that in some ways serve them well, in some ways serve them less well. So I'd like to talk about this at the level of the individual and interactions between pairs and larger groups and so on. But just to kick things off, what is cynicism? You know, I have my own ideas, but what is cynicism? What does it serve in terms of its role in the human mind?
The way that psychologists think of cynicism these days is as a theory about human beings. It's the idea that generally people at their core are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. Now, that's not to say that a cynical person will deny that somebody could act kindly, for instance, could donate to charity, could help a stranger. But they would say all of that kind and friendly behavior is a thin veneer covering up who we really are, which is self-interested. Another way of putting this is, there are these ancient philosophical questions about people. Are we good or bad, kind or cruel, caring or callous? And cynicism is answering all of those in the relatively bleak way that you might.
I believe in your book, you quote Kurt Vonnegut, who says, "We are who we pretend to be, so we need to be careful who we pretend to be." What do you think that quote means? How do you interpret that quote?
Thanks for bringing that up. Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors. And to me, that quote is enormously powerful because it expresses the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. There's this subjective sense that people have that our version of the world is the world, that we are passively taking in information veridically, dispassionately. And in fact, that's not the case. We each construct our own version of the world. And so, for instance, if you think about cynicism, right, are people kind or cruel? That's pretty much an unanswerable question at the level of science. It's a philosophical, some could argue even a theological question. But it turns out that the way you answer that goes a long way in constructing and shaping the life that you live, the decisions that you make. So cynics, maybe it's not so much about who they pretend to be, but it's about who they pretend everybody else is. right? If you decide that other people are selfish, for instance, you'll be far less likely to trust them. And there's a lot of evidence that cynics, when they're put in situations with new people, even when they interact with their friends, romantic partners, and families, that they still have their guard up, that they're not able to make trusting and deep connections with other people. But guess what? When you treat other people in that way, a couple of things happen. One, you're not able to receive what most of us need from social connections. There's one really classic and very sad study where people were forced to give an extemporaneous speech about a subject they don't know much about, a very stressful experience that raised people's blood pressure. Some of these folks had a cheerleader, not an actual cheerleader, but a friendly stranger who was with them while they prepared, saying, "You've got this. I know you can do it. I'm in your corner." Other people had no support. As you know, one of the great things about social support is that it buffers us from stress. So most people, when they had this friendly person by their side, their blood pressure as they prepared for the speech went up only half as much as when they were alone. But cynical people had a spike in their blood pressure that was indistinguishable in magnitude, whether or not a person was by their side or not. One way that I think about this is social connection is a deep and necessary form of psychological nourishment. And living a cynical life, making the decision that most people can't be trusted, stops you from being able to metabolize those calories, leaves you malnourished in a social way. A second thing that happens when you choose to pretend that others are selfish, greedy, and dishonest is that you bring out the worst in them. There's a lot of research that finds that cynical people tend to do things like monitoring others, spying on them, or threatening them to make sure that that other person doesn't betray them. But of course, other people can tell how we're treating them, and they reciprocate our kindness and retaliate against our unkindness. So cynical people end up bringing out the most selfish qualities of others, telling a story full of villains, and then ending up stuck living in that story.
How early in life does cynicism show up? I'm thinking about Sesame Street characters, which to me embody different neural circuits. You've got Cookie Monster, some strong dopaminergic drive there, knows what he wants, knows what he likes, and he's going to get it.
That great prefrontal system, maybe.
Right. Even if he has to eat the box in order to get to the cookie quicker. You have Elmo, who's all loving, and you have Oscar the Grouch. Somewhat cynical, but certainly grouchy. And then in, essentially every fairy tale or every Christmas story or, there seems to be sort of a skeptic or somebody that can't be brought on board the celebration that one would otherwise have. But even though kids are learning about cynicism and grouchiness and curmudgeons, I often think about those phenotypes in older folks because that's how they've been written into most of those stories. Mm-hmm. I guess Oscar the Grouch is, we don't know how old Oscar is. If one observes children, how early can you observe classically defined cynicism?
That's a great question. Classically defined cynicism would be hard to measure very early in life because you typically measure it through self-report. So people have to have relatively well-developed, elaborated stories that they can tell you about their version of the world. That said, one early experience and one early phenotype that's very strongly correlated with generalized mistrust, an unwillingness to count on other people would be insecure attachment early in life. So, for instance, you might know, but just for listeners, insecure attachment is a way of describing how kids experience the social world. It's often tested using something known as the strange situation, where a 1-year-old is brought to a lab with their caregiver, mother, father, whoever is caring for them. They're in a novel environment, and researchers are observing how much do they explore the space, how comfortable do they seem. Then after that, a stranger enters the room, couple minutes after that, their mother leaves the room or their caregiver leaves the room, which is, of course, incredibly strange and stressful for most one-year-olds. The caregiver then returns after a minute. And what researchers look at is a few things. One, how comfortable is the child exploring a space with their caregiver present? Two, how comfortable are they when other people are around? Three, how do they react when their caregiver leaves? And four, how do they react at the reunion with their caregiver? And the majority of kids, approximately 2/3 of them, are securely attached, meaning that they are comfortable exploring a new space. They get really freaked out, of course, as you might when their caregiver leaves, but then they soothe quickly when their caregiver returns. The remaining third or so of kids are insecurely attached, meaning that they're skittish in new environments even when their parent or caregiver is there. They really freak out when their caregiver leaves, and they're not very soothed upon their return. Now, for a long time, attachment style was viewed in very emotional terms. And it is an emotional reaction first and foremost. But researchers more recently have started to think about, well, what are the cognitive schemas? What are the underpinnings, the ways that children think when they are securely or insecurely attached? And one brilliant study used looking time. Looking time in kids is a metric of what surprises them. If something really surprising happens, they look for a very long time. And researchers found that insecurely attached kids, when they saw a video of a reunion of a caregiver and infant acting in a way that felt loving and stable, they looked longer, as though that was surprising. Kids who were securely attached didn't look very long at those stable interactions, but looked longer at interactions that were unstable.
Interesting.
It's almost as though there's a setup that kids develop very early. Can I count on people? Mm-hmm. Am I safe with people? And insecure attachment is a signal coming early in life, no, you're not safe with people, that I think, well, and the data show, elaborates later in life into mistrust in other relationships.
How different is cynicism from skepticism? I can think of some places where they might overlap, but cynicism seems to carry something of a lack of anticipation about any possibility of a positive future. Is that one way to think about it?
That's a very sharp way of thinking about it, actually. And I wish that people knew more about the discrepancy between these two ways of viewing the world. Cynicism and skepticism, people often use them interchangeably. In fact, they're quite different. And I would argue that one is much more useful for learning about the world and building relationships than the other. Again, cynicism is a theory that's kind of locked in, that no matter what people show you, their true colors are, again, untrustworthy and self-oriented. It's a hyper-Darwinian view, right? That ultimately people are red in tooth and claw. Skepticism is instead restlessness with our assumptions, a desire for new information. One way I often think about it is that cynics think a little bit like lawyers, right? They have a decision that they've already made about you and about everybody. And they're just waiting for evidence that supports their point. And when evidence comes in that doesn't support their point, they explain it away, right? And you see this, actually, that cynical people will offer more ulterior motives when they see an act of kindness, for instance. They'll explain it away. In that way, I think cynics actually are quite similar to the naive, trusting, gullible folks that they love to make fun of, right? Naivete, gullibility, is trusting people in a credulous, unthinking way. I would say cynicism is mistrusting people in a credulous and unthinking way. So if cynics then think like lawyers, sort of in the prosecution against humanity, skeptics think more like scientists. Skepticism, classically in philosophy, is the belief that you can never truly know anything. But as we think about it now, it's more the desire for evidence to underlie any claim that you believe. And the great thing about skepticism is it doesn't require an ounce of naivete, You can be absolutely sharp in deciding, I don't want to trust this person, or I do want to trust this person. But it allows you to update and learn from specific acts, specific instances, and specific people.
When I think about scientists, one of the first things I think about is not just their willingness, but their excitement to embrace complexity.
Yes.
Like, okay, these two groups disagree, or these two sets of data disagree, and it's the complexity of that interaction that excites them. Whereas when I think of cynics in the way that it's framed up in my mind, which I'm getting more educated now, but I admittedly, my understanding of cynicism is still rather superficial. You'll change that in the course of our discussion. But that cynics are not embracing the complexity of disagreement. They are moving away from the certainly any notion of excitement by complexity. It seems like it's a heuristic. It's a way to simplify the world around you.
That's exactly right. Phil Tetlock has a great term for this called integrative complexity. To what extent can you hold different versions of the world, different arguments in mind? To what extent can you pick from each one what you believe based on the best evidence available, right? And integrative complexity is a great way to learn about the world and about the social world, whereas cynicism, as you rightly point out, is much more of a heuristic. It's a black and white form of thinking. And the really sad thing is that cynicism then puts us in a position where we can't learn very much. This is what in learning theory is called a wicked learning environment. And I don't want to get too nerdy. Well, I guess I can get nerdy here.
You can get as nerdy as you want. This audience likes nerdy.
So let's think in Bayesian terms, right? So Bayesian statistics is where you have a set of beliefs about the world, you take new information in, and that new information allows you to update your priors, right, into a posterior distribution, into a new set of beliefs. And that's great. That's a great way to learn about the world, to adapt to new information and new circumstances. A wicked learning environment is where your priors prevent you from gathering the information that you would need to confirm or disconfirm them. So think about mistrust, for instance, right? It's easy to understand why people mistrust. You know, some of us are insecurely attached and we've been hurt in the past. We're trying to stay safe. We don't want to be betrayed. This is a completely natural response. It's a totally understandable response. But when we decide to mistrust, we never are able to learn whether the people who we are mistrusting would have been trustworthy or not. When we trust, we can learn whether we've been right or not, right? Somebody can betray us and that hurts and we remember it for years. Or more often than not, the data turn out to show us they can honor that trust. We can build a relationship. We can start a collaboration. We can live a full social life. And it turns out that the problem is that trusting people incorrectly, you do learn from. But mistrusting people incorrectly, you don't learn from because the missed opportunities are invisible to us.
Well, there's certainly a lot there that maps to many people's experience. So you pointed out that some degree of cynicism likely has roots in insecure attachment. That said, if one looks internationally, do we find cultures where it's very hard to find cynics? And there could be any number of reasons for this. Or perhaps even more interestingly, do we find cultures where there really isn't even a word for cynicism?
Wow. I love that question. There is a lot of variance in, and the data on cynicism are much more local to the U.S. typically. I mean, for better and for worse, a lot of research on this is done in an American context. But that said, there's a lot of data on generalized trust, which you could say is an inverse of cynicism, right? So for instance, there are national and international samples of major surveys which ask people whether they agree or disagree that most people can be trusted. And there's a lot of variance around the world. In general, the cultures that are most trusting have a couple of things in common. One, they are more economically equal than untrusting cultures. So there's a lot of great work from Kate Willett and Richard Wilkinson that they have a book called The Spirit Level, where they look at inequality across the world and relate it to public health outcomes. And one of them is trust. There's also variance in trust over time. So you can look at not just are there places or cultures that trust more than others, but when does a culture trust more or less? And in the US, that's sadly a story of decline. In 1972, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted. And by 2018, that had fallen to about a third of Americans. And that's a drop as big, just to put it in perspective, as the stock market took in the financial collapse of 2008. So there's a lot of variance here, both across space and time. And one of the, not the only, but one of the seeming characteristics of cultures that tracks that is how unequal they are. In part because research suggests that when you are in a highly unequal society, economically, there's a sense of zero-sum competition that develops. There's a sense that, wait a minute, anything that another person gets, I lose. And if you have that inherent sense of zero-sum competition, then it's very difficult to form bonds. It's very difficult to trust other people because you might think, well, in order to survive, this person has to try to outrun me. They have to try to trip me. They have to try to make me fail for themselves to succeed.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, AG1. By now, many of you have heard me say that if I could take just one supplement, that supplement would be AG1. The reason for that is AG1 is the highest quality and most complete of the foundational nutritional supplements available. What that means is that it contains not just vitamins and minerals, but also probiotics, prebiotics, and adaptogens to cover any gaps you may have in your diet and provide support for a demanding life. For me, even if I eat mostly whole foods and minimally processed foods, which I do for most of my food intake, it's very difficult for me to get enough fruits and vegetables, vitamins and minerals, micronutrients, and adaptogens from food alone. For that reason, I've been taking AG1 daily since 2012 and often twice a day, once in the morning or mid-morning and again in the afternoon or evening. When I do that, it clearly bolsters my energy, my immune system, and my gut microbiome. These are all critical to brain function, mood, physical performance, and much more. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim their special offer. Right now, they're giving away 5 free travel packs plus a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim that special offer. What is the relationship, if any, between cynicism and happiness or lack of happiness? When I think of somebody who's really cynical, I think of it Oscar the Grouch or a curmudgeon-like character. And as I ask this question, I'm thinking specifically about what you said earlier about how cynicism prevents us from certain forms of learning that are important and very valuable to us. Here's the reason why. I'll give just a little bit of context. I remember when I was a kid, my dad, who went to classic boarding schools, he grew up in South America, but he went to these boarding schools that were very strict.
Yeah.
And he was taught, he told me, that to be cheerful and happy, people would accuse you of being kind of dumb. Whereas if you were cynical and you acted a little bored with everything, people thought that you were more discerning.
Yeah.
But that he felt it was a terrible model for going through life because it veered into cynicism. My dad happens to be a scientist.
Yeah.
He's I think a relatively happy person. Sorry, Dad, a happy person. Seems happy, but meaning he's a person who has happiness and he has other emotions too. I wouldn't say he's happy all the time, but he experiences joy and pleasure in daily small things and big things in life. So clearly he rescued himself from that, the forces that were kind of pushing him down that path. But that's the anecdote. But I use that question more as a way to frame up the possible collaboration between cynicism and exuding boredom or a challenge in shifting somebody towards like happier affect.
Yeah.
Because when I think about cynics, I think that they're like kind of unhappy people.
Yeah.
And when I think about people who are not very cynical, I think of them as kind of cheerful and curious. And there's some ebullience there. They might not be Tigger-like in their affect, but they kind of veer that direction.
Andrew, I love this trip down memory lane. I'm having all these childhood memories of Tigger and Sesame Street. There's so much in what you're saying. I want to try to pull on a couple of threads here, if that's okay. First, and this one is pretty straightforward, the effect of cynicism on well-being is just really documented and quite negative. So there are large prospective studies with tens of thousands of people, several of these studies that measure cynicism and then measure life outcomes in the years and decades afterwards. And the news is pretty bleak for cynics, right? So absolutely lower levels of happiness, flourishing, satisfaction with life, greater incidence of depression, greater loneliness. But, it's not just the neck up that cynicism affects. Cynics over the course of their lives also tend to have greater degrees of cellular inflammation, more incidence of heart disease. And they even have higher rates of all-cause mortality, so shorter lives than non-cynics. And again, this might sound like, wait a minute, you go from a philosophical theory to a shorter life. The answer is, yeah, you do, because, and again, these are correlational studies, so I don't want to draw too many causal claims, but they're quite rigorous and control for a lot of other factors. But I would say that this is consistent with the idea that really one of the great protectors of our health is our sense of connection to other people. And if you are unable or unwilling to be vulnerable around others, to really touch in to that type of connection, it stands to reason that things like chronic stress and isolation would impact not just your mind, but all through your body and your organ systems. So again, the news here is not great. And I often think about, one of the best encapsulations of a cynical view of life comes from Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, who in his book Leviathan said, we need a restrictive government because left to our own devices, human life is nasty, brutish, and short. And ironically, I think that might describe the lives of cynics themselves more than most people. So that's point one, right, is that there is this pretty stark negative correlation between cynicism and a lot of life outcomes that we might want for ourselves. But point two, I think, is related to what your dad also noticed, which is that, right, if cynicism hurts us so much, why would we adopt it? Right? If there was a pill that as its side effects listed depression, loneliness, heart disease, and early death, it would be a poison, right? It would have a skull and crossbones on the bottle. But yet we're swallowing it. More of us are swallowing it than we did in years and decades past. Why? Well, one of the answers, I think, is because our culture glamorizes cynicism. It's because of the very stereotype that your father pointed out, which is that if you're happy-go-lucky, if you trust people, that kind of seems dull. It seems like maybe you're not that sharp. Maybe you don't understand the world. And there is that strong relationship in our stereotypes, in our models of the world. Susan Fiske and many other psychologists have studied warmth and competence, right? How friendly and caring does somebody seem, and how able do they seem to accomplish hard things. And it turns out that in many studies, people's perception is that these are inversely correlated, that if you're warm, maybe you're not that competent, and if you're competent, maybe you shouldn't be that warm. And in fact, if you tell people to act as competently as they can, they'll often respond by being a little bit less nice, a little bit less warm than they would be otherwise. There's also data that find that, where people are presented in surveys with a cynic and a non-cynic. They're told about, here's one person, they really think that people are great overall, and they tend to be trusting. Here's another person who thinks that people are kind of out for themselves and really doesn't trust most folks. And then they'll ask those people, who should we pick for this difficult intellectual task? And 70% of respondents pick a cynical person over a non-cynic for difficult intellectual tasks. 85% of people think that cynics are socially wiser, that they'd be able, for instance, to detect who's lying and who's telling the truth. So most of us put a lot of faith in people who don't have a lot of faith in people. Ironically, and even more ironically, we're wrong to do so. Olga Stavrova, this great psychologist who studies cynicism, has this paper called The Cynical Genius Illusion, where she documents all these biases, the way that we think cynics are bright and wise, and then uses national data, tens of thousands of people, to show that actually cynics do less well on cognitive tests, on mathematical tests, that trust is related with things like intelligence and education, and that in other work, this is not from Olga Steverova, but from others, that actually cynics do less well than non-cynics in detecting liars. Because if you have a blanket assumption about people, you're not actually attending to evidence in a sharp way. You're not actually taking in new information and making wise decisions.
In other words, cynics are not being scientific. Their hypothesis is cast, but they're not looking at the data equally. Right? And we should remind people that a hypothesis is not a question. Every great experiment starts with a question, and then you generate a hypothesis, which is a theory or a conclusion essentially made up front, and then you go collect data and you see if you prove or disprove the hypothesis.
Yeah.
And you can never really prove a hypothesis. You can only support it or not support it with the data that you collect, depending on the precision of your tools. But that's very interesting, because I would think that if we view cynics as smarter, which clearly they're not as a group, right? You're saying cynics are not more intelligent, right? I believe that's covered in your book. And if one knows that, then, why do we send cynics in kind of like razors to assess what the environment is like? Is that because we'd rather have others deployed for us to kind of like weed people out? Is it that we're willing to accept some false negatives? Meaning, for those that I guess we're using a little bit of a semi-technical language here, false negatives would be, you're trying to assess a group of people that would be terrific employees.
Yeah.
And you send in somebody to interview them that's very cynical. So presumably in one's mind, that filter of cynicism is only going to allow in people that are really, really right for the job.
Yeah.
And we're willing to accept that, there are probably 2 or 3 candidates that would also be right for the job, but we're willing to let them go, some false negatives, as opposed to having someone get through the filter who really can't do the job. Like, we're willing to let certain opportunities go by being cynical, or by deploying a cynic as I'm imagining the person with the clipboard, very rigid.
Yeah.
Like cynicism and rigidity seem to go together. So that's why I'm lumping these kind of psychological phenotypes.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And so a couple of things. One, you said that if we know that cynics aren't smarter than non-cynics, why are we deploying them? Well, let's be clear. We know this, meaning you and I know this, and scientists know this, but the data show that most people don't know this, that we maintain the stereotype in our culture that being negative about people means that you've been around the block enough times, that it is a form of wisdom. So that's a stereotype that I think we need to dispel, first of all. But I do think that, to your point, when we deploy cynics out in the field, when we say, I'm going to be nice, but I want somebody who's really pretty negative, who's really pretty suspicious to protect me or to protect my community, I think that's a really, again, understandable instinct, almost from an evolutionary perspective. We are built to pay lots of attention to threats in our environment and threats to our community. And in the early social world, if you wind, just to do some back of the envelope evolutionary psychology, if you wind the clock back 100, 150,000 years, what is the greatest threat to early communities? It's people, right? It's people who would take advantage of our communal nature, right? The thing that allows human beings to thrive is that we collaborate. But that collaboration means that a free rider, somebody who chooses to not pitch in, but still take out from the common pool anything that they want, can do exceptionally well. They can live a life of leisure on the backs of a community that's working hard. And if you select then for that type of person, if that type of person proliferates, then the community collapses. So it makes sense that we depend on cynics from that perspective, from a threat mitigation perspective, from a risk aversion perspective. But it doesn't make sense from the perspective of trying to optimize our actual social lives, right? And I think that oftentimes we are risk averse in general, meaning that we're more scared of negative outcomes than we are enticed by positive outcomes. But in the social world, that risk aversion is, I think, quite harmful in a lot of demonstrable ways.
Is cynicism domain specific? And there again, I'm using jargon, meaning if somebody is cynical in one environment, like cynical about the markets, like, well, things are up now, but, have an election come, so things could go this way or that way, depending on, do they tend to be cynical about other aspects of life, other domains?
So there's a little bit of data on this, and it suggests a couple of things. One, left to our own devices, our levels of cynicism tend to be pretty stable over time, and also decline in older adulthood, contra the stereotype of the curmudgeonly older person. But another is that cynicism does tend to be pretty domain general. So, for instance, cynics, people, and this makes sense if you look at questionnaires that assess cynicism, which are things like people are honest chiefly through fear of getting caught, or most people really don't like helping each other. I mean, if you're answering those questions positively, you're just not a fan of, you're probably not great at parties, you're not a fan of people. And it turns out that people who answer this is an old scale developed by a couple of psychologists named Walter Cook and Donald Medley in the 1950s. If you answer the Cook-Medley hostility scale, if you answer these questions positively, you tend to be less trusting of strangers. But you also tend to, for instance, have less trust in your romantic partnerships. You have less trust in your friends, and you have less trust in your colleagues. So this is sort of an all-purpose view of the world, at least as Cook and Medley first thought about it. But I do want to build on a great intuition you have, which is that different environments might bring out cynicism or tamp it down. And it turns out that that's also very true. As trait-like as cynicism can be, there's lots of evidence that the type of social environment we're in matters a lot. One of my favorite studies in this domain came from southeastern Brazil. There are two fishing villages in southeastern Brazil. They're separated by about 30, 40 miles. They're similar in socioeconomic status, religion, culture, but there's one big difference between them. One of the villages sits on the ocean, and in order to fish on the ocean, you need big boats, heavy equipment. You can't do it alone. You must work together. The other village is on a lake where fishermen strike out on small boats alone, and they compete with one another. About 10 years ago, economists, this was a study led by Andreas Liebrandt, a really great economist, they went to these villages and they gave the folks who work there a bunch of social games to play. These were not with fellow fishermen, but with strangers. Games like, would you trust somebody with some money and see if they then want to share dividends with you? Or given some money yourself, would you like to share some of it with another person? And they found that when they start in their careers, lake fishermen and ocean fishermen were equally trusting and equally trustworthy as well. But over the course of their careers, they diverged. Being in a collaborative environment where people must count on one another to survive made people over time more trusting and more trustworthy. Being in a competitive zero-sum environment over time made people less trusting and less trustworthy. Now, one thing that always amazes me about this work is that people in both of these environments are right. If you're in a competitive environment, you don't trust, and you're right to not trust. If you're in a collaborative environment, you do trust, and you're right to trust. And this is from the point of view of economic games, and I think much broadly construed as well. So one question then becomes, well, which of these environments do we want to be in, right? I think the costs in terms of well-being and relationships is quite obvious if you're in a competitive environment. And then the second question, of course, is how do we put ourselves in the type of environment that we want, knowing that that environment will change who we are over the course of our lives?
So much of schooling in this country is based on, at first, cooperation, like we're all going to sit around and listen to a story, and then we're going to work in small groups. But in my experience, over time, it evolves into more independent learning and competition. They post the distribution of scores that's largely the distribution of individual scores. There are exceptions to this, of course. Like I think I've never been to business school, but I think they form small groups and work on projects. It's true in computer science at the undergraduate level and so on. But to what extent do you think having a mixture of cooperative learning, still competition perhaps between groups, as well as individual learning and competition can foster kind of an erosion of cynicism? Because it sounds like being cynical is, I don't want to be hard on the cynics here, but they're probably already hard on themselves and everybody else. We know they're hard on everybody else. But, there was my presumption. Okay, I'm going to stay open-minded. Maybe they're not. You'll tell me. That they are, on average, less intelligent is what I'm hearing. And that there's something really big to be gained from anybody who decides to embrace novel ideas, even if they decide to stick with their original decision about others or something, provided they explore the data in an open-minded way, even transiently. It sounds like there's an opportunity there. You gave a long-term example of these two fishing scenarios. So the neuroplasticity takes years, but we know neuroplasticity can be pretty quick. I would imagine if you expose a cynic to a counterexample to their belief, that it's not going to erode all of their cynicism, but it might make a little dent in that neural circuit for cynicism.
Yeah, this is a great perspective. And, a couple of things I want to be clear on. One, I am not here to judge or impugn cynics. I should confess that I myself struggle with cynicism and have for my entire life. Part of my journey to learn more about it and even to write this book was an attempt to understand myself and to see if it is possible to unlearn cynicism, because frankly, I wanted to. So you will get no judgment from me of people who feel like it's hard to trust. I think that another point that you're bringing out that I want to co-sign is that saying that competition over the long term, zero-sum competition can erode our trust, isn't the same as saying that we should never compete. Competition is beautiful. I mean, it's the Olympics are going on right now, and it's amazing to see what people do when they are at odds, trying to best one another. Incredible feats are accomplished when we focus on the great things that we can do, and oftentimes we are driven to greatness by people we respect who are trying to be greater than us. So absolutely, competition can be part of a very healthy social structure and a very healthy life. I think that the broader question is whether we construe that competition at the level of a task or at the level of the person. Right? In fact, there's a lot of work in the science of conflict and conflict resolution that looks at the difference between task conflict and personal conflict. You can imagine in a workplace, two people have different ideas for what direction they want to take a project in. Well, that's great if it leads to healthy debate and if that is mutually respectful. But the minute that turns into blanket judgments about the other person, the reason that they want this direction is because they're not so bright, or because they don't have vision, or because they're trying to gain favor, that's when we go from healthy, skeptical conflict into cynical and destructive conflict. Right? And you see this with athletes as well. Athletes often are very good friends, and some of the people that they respect the most are the folks who they're battling. In the case of contact sports and boxing, literally battling, but they can have immense and positive regard for one another outside of the ring in those contexts. So I think that there's a huge difference between competition that's oriented on tasks, which can help us be the best version of ourselves, and competition that bleeds into judgment, suspicion, and mistrust.
I'd like to take us back just briefly to these developmental stages. Maybe I'm bridging two things that don't belong together, but I'm thinking about the young brain, which of course is hyperplastic, and comparing that to the older brain. But the young brain learns a number of things while it does a number of things. It handles heart rate, digestion, et cetera, unconsciously. And then in many ways, the neuroplasticity that occurs early in life is to establish these maps of prediction. If things fall down, not up in general. Yeah. Things fall down, not up, and so on. so that mental real estate can be used for other things and learning new things. So I'm thinking about the sort of classic example of object permanence. You show a baby a block or a toy, and then you hide that toy, and they, at a certain age, a very young age, will look as if it's gone. And then you bring it back, and then they're amazed. And then at some point along their developmental trajectory, they learn object permanence. They know that it's behind your back, okay? And then we hear that characters like Santa Claus are real, and then eventually we learn that they're not, and so on and so on. In many ways, we go from being completely non-cynical about the physical world to being, one could sort of view it as cynical about the physical world, right? Like, I love to see magic. In fact, we had probably the world's best, or among the very best magicians on this podcast, Ozzy Wind. He's a mentalist and magician. And to see him do magic, even as an adult who understands that the laws of physics apply, they seem to defy the laws of physics in real time. And it just blows your mind to the point where you like, how, that can't be, but you sort of want it to be. And at some point you just go, you know what? It's what we call magic. So it seems to me that cynics apply almost physics-like rules to social interaction, like that. They talk in terms of like first principles of human interactions, right? They talk about this group always this and that group always that, right? These like strict categories, thick black lines between categories, as opposed to any kind of blending of understanding or blending of rules. And one can see how that would be a really useful heuristic, but as we're learning, it's not good in the sense that we don't want to judge, but it's not good if our goal is to learn more about the world or learn the most information about the world. Can we say that?
Yes, and I appreciate you saying, I also try to avoid good, bad language or moral judgment, but I think that many of us have the goals of having strong relationships and of flourishing psychologically and of learning accurately about the world. And if those are your goals, I think it's fair to say that cynicism can block your way towards them. I love this. I've never thought about it in this way, but I love that perspective. And there is almost a philosophical certainty. Maybe it's not a happy philosophical certainty, but we love to, right? Human beings love explanatory power. We love to be able to have laws that determine what will happen. And the laws of physics are some of our most reliable, right? And really, we all use theories to predict the world, right? I mean, we all have a theory of gravity that lives inside our head. We don't think objects with mass attract one another, but we know if we drop a bowling ball on our foot, we're going to probably maybe not walk for the next week or at least, right? So we use theories to provide explanatory simplicity to a vast and overwhelmingly complex world. And absolutely, I think cynicism has a great function in simplifying. But of course, in simplifying, we lose a lot of the detail. We lose a lot of the wonder that maybe we experienced earlier in life. And, you know, I do want to, your beautiful description of kids and their sort of sense of, I suppose, perennial surprise makes me think about another aspect of what we lose to cynicism, which is the ability to witness the beauty of human action and human kindness. My friend Dacher Keltner studies awe, you know, this emotion of experiencing something vast and also experiencing ourselves as small and a part of that vastness. And he wrote a great book on awe. And in it, he talks about his research where he cataloged what are the experiences that most commonly produce awe in a large sample, large representative sample of people. Now, I don't know about you, Andrew, but when I think about awe, my first go-to is Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. This image of a kind of nebula band, or, you know, a sort of cluster, basically, stardust, really. And there's one dot in it with an arrow, and Carl Sagan says, that dot is Earth, and every king and tyrant and mother and father and every person who's ever fallen in love and every person who's ever had their heart broken, they're all on that tiny dot there. I go to that, I show that to my kids all the time. When I think of awe, I think of outer space. I think of groves of redwood trees. I think of drone footage of the Himalayas, right? But Dacker finds that if you ask people what they experience awe in response to, the number one category is what he calls moral beauty. Everyday acts of kindness, giving, compassion, and connection. This is also related to what Dacker and John Haidt talk about in terms of moral elevation, witnessing positive actions that actually make us feel like we're capable of more. And moral beauty is everywhere. If you are open to it, it is the most common thing that will make you feel the vastness of our species. And to have a lawful, physics-like prediction about the world that blinkers you from seeing that gives you tunnel vision and prevents you from experiencing moral beauty seems like a tragic form of simplicity.
I'd like to take a quick break and thank one of our sponsors, Function. I recently became a Function member after searching for the most comprehensive approach to lab testing. While I've long been a fan of blood testing, I really wanted to find a more in-depth program for analyzing blood, urine, and saliva to get a full picture of my heart health, my hormone status, my immune system regulation, my metabolic function, my vitamin and mineral status, and other critical areas of my overall health and vitality. Function not only provides testing of over 100 biomarkers key to physical and mental health, but it also analyzes these results and provides insights from top doctors on your results. For example, in one of my first tests with Function, I learned that I had 2 high levels of mercury in my blood. This was totally surprising to me. I had no idea prior to taking the test. Function not only helped me detect this, but offered medical doctor-informed insights on how to best reduce those mercury levels, which included limiting my tuna consumption, because I had been eating a lot of tuna, while also making an effort to eat more leafy greens and supplementing with NAC, N-acetylcysteine, both of which can support glutathione production and detoxification and worked to reduce my mercury levels. Comprehensive lab testing like this is so important for health, and while I've been doing it for years, I've always found it to be overly complicated and expensive. I've been so impressed by Function, both at the level of ease of use, that is getting the tests done, as well as how comprehensive and how actionable the tests are, that I recently joined their advisory board, and I'm thrilled that they're sponsoring the podcast. If you'd like to try Function, go to functionhealth.com/Huberman. Function currently has a wait list of over 250,000 people, but they're offering early access to Huberman Lab listeners. Again, that's functionhealth.com/Huberman to get early access to Function. I love that your examples of awe, both pale blue dot and everyday compassion, bridge the two, what I think of as time domains that or I should say space-time domains that the brain can encompass. You know, this has long fascinated me about the human brain and presumably other animals' brains as well, which is that, you know, we can sharpen our aperture to, you know, something so small and pay attention to just like the immense beauty. And, you know, like I have a lot of ants in my yard right now. And lately I've been watching them interact because they were driving me crazy. They were just like, they're like everywhere this summer and they're climbing on me. And I thought, I'm just kind of like watch what they do. And clearly there's a structure there. I know Deborah Gordon at Stanford has studied ant behavior and others. And it's like, there's a lot going on there. But then you look up from there, you're like, wow, there's a big yard. And then the sense of awe for me is that interactions like that must be going on everywhere in this yard. And, you know, it frames up that the aperture of our cognition in space and in time, you know, covering small distances quickly or small distances slowly. And then we can zoom out literally and think about us on this ball in space, right? You know, and that ability I think is incredible. And that awe can be captured at these different extremes of space-time cognition. Amazing. It seems to me that what you're saying is that cynicism and awe are also at opposite ends of the continuum. And that's taking us in a direction slightly different than I was going to try and take us. But I love that we're talking about awe because to me, it feels like it's a more extreme example of delight. And I'd like you to perhaps, if there's any examples of research on this, you know, touch on to what extent a sense of cynicism divorces us from delight and awe, or I guess their collaborator, which is creativity. To me, everything you're saying about cynicism makes it sound anti-creative because you're by definition, you're eliminating possibility. And creativity, of course, is the unique original combination of existing things or the creation of new things altogether, creativity.
Yeah.
So what, if anything, has been studied about the relationship between cynicism, I guess we call it open-mindedness, and creativity and or awe?
Yeah, great questions. And there is some work on this, and a lot of it comes actually in the context of the workplace, right? So you can examine these Brazilian fishing villages were, after all, workplaces, right? That led people to more or less cynicism. But other workplaces also have structures that make people more or less able to trust one another. One version of this is what's known as stack ranking. And, this is where people, managers, are forced to pick the highest performing and lowest performing members of their team.
And I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University. She also holds appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, where she is the chief scientific officer of the Center of Law, Brain, and Behavior. Dr. Barrett is considered one of the top world experts in the study of emotions, and her laboratory has studied emotions using approaches both from the fields of psychology and neuroscience. Indeed, today you will learn about the neural circuits and the psychological underpinnings of what we call emotions. You will learn what emotions truly are and how to interpret different emotional states. You will also learn how emotions relate to things like motivation, consciousness, and affect. Affect is a term that refers to a more general state of brain and body that increases or decreases the probability that you will experience certain emotions. During today's discussion, Dr. Feldman Barrett also teaches us how to regulate our emotions effectively, as well as how to better interpret the emotional states of others. You will also learn about the powerful relationship that exists between our emotional states and the movement of our body. In fact, much of today's discussion is both practical and will be highly informative in terms of the mechanisms underlying emotions, and it is likely to also be surprising to you in a number of ways. It certainly was surprising to me. I've been a close follower of Dr. Feldman Barrett's work over many years now and have always found it to be tremendously informative. And when I say her work, I mean both her academic published papers as well as her public lectures that she's given and her two fabulous books on emotions in the brain. The first one entitled How Emotions Are Made, and the second book, which includes information about emotions but extends beyond that, entitled 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. As you'll see from today's discussion, Dr. Feldman Barrett is not only extremely informed about the neuroscience and psychology of emotion, she's also fabulously good at teaching us that information in clear terms and in actionable ways. You'll also notice several times she pushes back on my questions, in some cases even telling me that my questions are ill-posed. And I have to tell you that I was absolutely delighted that she did that, because you'll see that every time she did that, it was with the clear purpose of putting more specificity on the question and thereby more specificity and clarity on the answer, which of course she delivers. By the end of today's discussion, you will have both a broad and a deep understanding of what emotions are and their origins in our brain and body. You will also have many practical tools with which to better understand and navigate emotional states. And moreover, you will have many practical tools in order to increase your levels of motivation and better understand your various states of consciousness. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. I've spoken many times before on this podcast about the fact that sleep is the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance. One of the key things to getting a great night's sleep is to control the temperature of your sleeping environment. And that's because in order to fall and stay deeply asleep, your body temperature has to drop by 1 to 3 degrees. And in order to wake up in the morning feeling refreshed, your body temperature actually has to increase by 1 to 3 degrees. With 8 Sleep, it's very easy to control the temperature of your sleeping environment. It's a mattress cover that allows you to control the temperature of your sleeping environment at the beginning, middle, and end of your night. And in doing so, allow you to fall and stay deeply asleep throughout the night and wake up feeling extremely refreshed. I started sleeping on an 8 Sleep mattress cover well over 2 years ago, and it has greatly improved the quality of my sleep. If you'd like to try 8 Sleep, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman to save up to $150 off their Pod 3 cover. 8 Sleep currently ships in the USA, Canada, UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Levels. Levels is a program that lets you see how different foods and behaviors affect your health by giving you real-time feedback using a continuous glucose monitor. One of the most important factors impacting your immediate and long-term health is the way that your body manages its blood glucose, or sometimes referred to as blood sugar levels. To maintain energy and focus throughout the day, you want to keep your blood glucose steady without big spikes or dips. Using Levels, you can monitor how different types of foods and different food combinations, as well as food timing and things like exercise, combine to impact your blood glucose levels. I started using Levels a little over a year ago, and it gave me a lot of insight into how specific foods were spiking my blood sugar and then leaving me feeling tired for several hours afterwards, as well as how the spacing of exercise and my meals was impacting my overall energy. And in doing so, it really allowed me to optimize how I eat, what I eat, when I exercise, and so on, such that my blood glucose levels and energy levels are stable throughout the day. If you're interested in learning more about Levels and trying a continuous glucose monitor yourself, go to levels.link/Huberman. Right now, Levels is offering an additional 2 free months of membership. Again, that's levels.link, LINK/Huberman to get 2 free months of membership. And now for my discussion with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
I've wanted to talk to you for a very long time. I'd like to talk about emotions. I think everyone has a sense somehow of what an emotion is. Feeling happy, feeling sad, feeling excited, feeling curious, perhaps is even an emotion. I don't know. You'll tell us. What are the core components? What are the sort of macronutrients of an emotion? Because I know there's a debate about whether or not we should be talking about emotions versus states. But what is an emotion? We all are familiar with what one feels like to us, but from a scientific perspective, how do you define an emotion?
Well, this is a scientist debate about this. Nobody in the last 150 years has ever been able to agree on what an emotion is. And I think from my perspective, the interesting but tricky bit is that anytime you want to talk about what the basic building blocks are of emotion, none of those basic building blocks are specific to emotion. So for example, there are a group of scientists who will tell you, well, an emotion is a coordinated response where you have a change in some physical state, a change in the brain, a change in the physical state, which leads you to make a particular facial expression. So you've got physiological changes in the body, changes in the brain, changes in the face or in motor movements. Okay, but that describes basically every moment of your life. Your face is always moving in some way. If it wasn't, you would look like an avatar, basically. So we're constantly engaged in movements, and those movements have to be coordinated with the physiological changes in the body, because whether we're in a state that we would conventionally call emotion or not, because the physiology is supporting those. It's supporting the glucose and the oxygen and all the things that you need to make movements of your body. And of course, all these movements are being coordinated by your brain. So of course there's a coordinated set of features. That doesn't really describe how emotions are distinct from any other experience that you have. But the claim was for a really long time that there would be diagnostic patterns. Okay, so when something triggered fear, you would have an increase in heart rate, and you would have a propensity to run away or to freeze, or not just to fall asleep, although that is something animals do when they are faced with a predator. But that's not part of the Western stereotype for fear, so that wasn't what scientists were looking for. And also that you would make a particular facial expression, which was presumed to be the universal expression of fear, where you widen your eyes and you gasp, like, that set of facial movements in other cultures, like in Melanesian culture, for example, is a symbol of threat, where you are threatening someone. You are threatening them with aggression, basically. It is a war face. But in Western cultures, that's the face that Western scientists believed was the distinctive part of that distinctive pattern for fear. And so the way that scientists defined emotion for a long time was these kind of states where you'd see this diagnostic ensemble of signals, and that would mean that anytime someone showed one of those signals, they may move their face in a particular way or their heart increased at a particular time, you'd be able to diagnose them as being in a state of fear as opposed to a state of anger or sadness or whatever. The empirical evidence